Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to kick us off this morning. Good morning. My name is Sarah Bunn, and I manage workforce housing and engagement for Minnesota Housing's Multifamily Division. Welcome to the 2023 Multifamily Consolidated Request for Proposal Technical Assistance Kickoff event. This will be a two-part virtual event. Day one, which is today, we will provide an introduction to Minnesota Housing and Multifamily Consolidated RFP 101 for those that are new to Minnesota Housing. Tomorrow, which is day two, we will focus on updates and new information for the Multifamily Consolidated RFP. Today, multifamily staff will be giving you an introduction to the Multifamily Consolidated RFP. This day is intended to give those new to the agency an overview of our programs and how we allocate funding. It is going to focus on our process and is not intended to be a replacement for development or affordable housing experience. Staff will then move into introducing the following related topics: underwriting, low-income housing tax credits, housing infrastructure bonds, and supportive housing. In addition to this presentation as a tool for emerging developers, I will also be introducing some related programs that our partners are involved with at the end of this presentation. Minnesota Housing also has a new website that was rolled out last month, which focuses on being a more user-friendly experience. Please check that out when you have a moment at mnhousing.gov. A survey will be sent at a later date requesting feedback on your experience with today's virtual kickoff. Thank you in advance for providing feedback so that we can continue to structure the feedback responsibly, or excuse me, the kickoff responsibly. Today's presentation will run until approximately 11:05, at which time we will conduct a group question and answer session. This session is intended for participants to ask questions on any of the presented topics or materials. We will also post a recorded version of today's webinar on our website for following the TA kickoff. Thank you for attending virtually today. I also want to extend an appreciation to the Minnesota Housing team who have prepared today's content to be able to engage with you as we start the technical assistance season. Next slide, please. Minnesota Housing provides access to safe, decent, and affordable housing and builds stronger communities across the state. Minnesota Housing offers products and services to help Minnesotans buy and fix up their homes and to stabilize neighborhoods, communities, and families. It also supports the development and preservation of affordable rental housing through both financing and long-term asset management. It has pioneered a successful model for supportive housing that helps stabilize the lives of some of the state's most vulnerable citizens. Next slide, please. Due to time constraints, questions will not be answered until the end of the entire presentation, at which time there will be a group question and answer session. You can either type your questions into the questions section or chat box of the GoToWebinar at any time, or you can wait and ask questions during the question and answer session at the end. Next slide, please. We encourage you to request technical assistance using our technical assistance request form. We will discuss this further along in the presentation. Next slide, please. Here is a quick overview of today's agenda. You should also have received this agenda when you signed up for the webinar. Next slide, please. I would now like to introduce Summer Jefferson, the Multifamily Programs Manager.
Okay, let's try that one more time. Good morning. Thank you, Sarah. Good morning, everyone. And thank you all for joining us and for sharing your time today with us today. My name is Summer Jefferson. I am the manager for the programs team in the multifamily division at Minnesota Housing. So our team oversees the multifamily consolidated RFP process and a number of the state and federal programs that are included in the RFP, including the housing tax credit program and housing infrastructure bonds. We are pleased to be able to hold this event with you again this year. This time of year is definitely an exciting time at the agency, as it is a milestone to kind of mark the initial culmination of so much hard work in coordination with all of you, and it makes funding available to help build and preserve homes that are affordable to communities throughout Minnesota. The Multifamily Consolidated RFP is uniquely Minnesotan, and it has been around for decades, but it has certainly grown and changed over time as the resources, the economy, the market, and the needs across the state have changed. So I want to take this opportunity to say thank you to the multifamily team for all the work thus far, and then of course all the work there is still to come. I also want to thank all of you again for attending today. We appreciate your continued participation and your partnership in this industry and in the RFP process itself. So as Sarah mentioned, for the last couple of years, we have changed the configuration of this kickoff, so into 2 different days based upon your direct feedback. So today we want to offer a more detailed introduction to the Multifamily Consolidated RFP application process, which includes, again, some of the processes, the programs that are incorporated, and the policies. The agency is really focused on creating opportunities for diverse ownership and community partnership. Multifamily staff have been focusing on putting in place the infrastructure to support new and emerging developers in Black, Indigenous, and people of color via updates to our policies, our scoring, and other processes. So we've had a number of policy changes in order to incentivize and prioritize that. From a funding perspective, these efforts were reflected in the projects that were recommended for selection in our last RFP, the 2022 Multifamily Consolidated RFP, and we're extremely pleased that 14 out of the 17 selected projects last year included a Black, Indigenous, person of color, or women-owned business, women-owned or led business entity on the development team, which includes owners, sponsors, developers, architectural staff, or architects, contractors, and or management agents. This also included 4 tribal projects and 2 projects that were from new developers to the Minnesota housing selection process. In addition to the policy changes, we also recognize that there are other areas that can present barriers for entry. So one of those is the complexity of the multifamily industry itself and our application process. While we cover some of the benefits of the consolidation into our one application process today, we still understand that that also represents additional complexity for applicants as they apply to us for funding. So this presentation is meant to be another resource to kind of introduce new developers to Minnesota housing and the financing involved in the complex world of affordable housing. Our strategy is to break out some of the details and the content into separate webinars and training opportunities for you. So we cover most of the content-heavy RFP and the program training in today's session. And then tomorrow we'll kind of shift to looking at the specific updates that have taken place from last year to this year. In addition to today's kickoff, which was recorded and will be available to you, we also offer separate detailed trainings that will be coming out and are available for you to register today. There's a separate detailed scoring wizard training where we go through our self-scoring worksheet training. And there are also supportive housing training that will be coming up as well, and portal tutorials that you will also see come out. So a lot of opportunities for you to get training on demand and available for you, and also to connect with staff if you have additional questions. So again, thank you all for attending, and I will hand it over to Q. Next slide.
All right, thank you, Summer. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I am Q Vang, the Consolidated RFP Manager. I get the pleasure of providing you all with some high-level information regarding the Multifamily Consolidated RFP. Next slide, please. Let's start with what is the Multifamily Consolidated RFP. The Consolidated RFP is Minnesota Housing's largest competitive request for proposals. It is multifamily division's annual process where various entities can submit an application requesting for capital funding for multifamily affordable housing efforts throughout the state. The Multifamily Consolidated RFP allows applicants to submit one application to apply for a variety of available resources. One of the key benefits of the Multifamily Consolidated RFP is a consistent application and funding cycle that allows adequate planning time at the community level and also a streamlined application review process. Minnesota Housing is able to review all applications at one time and compare scoring, feasibility, other review considerations across all submittals in order to maximize the number of projects that get funded each year throughout the state. Next slide, please. Some other key benefits to having one application is the ability to match all of the funding resources of eligible uses with each project type. The Consolidated RFP is further unique in the sense that we offer dual funding structure options. This means applicants may request to be considered for two funding structures in one application. All of these benefits result in minimizing funding gaps while maximizing all of the resources. Next slide, please. I would like to take some time to share the necessary steps when applicants want to apply for the Multifamily Consolidated RFP. These steps are detailed in the Multifamily RFP standards. I strongly recommend all applicants review the RFP standards in full, as the RFP standards provide requirements and guidance to the Consolidated RFP and housing tax credit funding rounds. The first step is to review the available resources and request technical assistance. Resources is referred to both the materials to understand the Consolidated RFP and its complexities, but also the funding sources and its guides. Afterwards, we strongly recommend requesting technical assistance. The second and third step is to review the eligibility, funding, and application requirements for the Consolidated RFP. The fourth is to determine the financial structure and application type you would like to submit. Financial structure is essentially the type of funding that you are interested in. For an instance, 9% housing tax credit only, 9% housing tax credit with deferred loans, deferred loans with 4% housing tax credit, or deferred loans only. As I had mentioned earlier, you may submit a single or dual financial structure application. The fifth is to create an account and submit your application through the Multifamily Customer Portal, which is the only application tool we are using for applicants to submit their application. And lastly, gather all the application materials and submit the application. Next slide, please. Now that I've provided you with some high-level overview of the benefits to having one Consolidated RFP and the steps to apply, I do believe it is extremely important for you to understand the policy and guidance documents for the Consolidated RFP. These documents displayed really set the priorities and standards that explain the processes in how projects are selected through the Consolidated RFP. Let's start with the Housing Tax Credit Qualified Allocation Plan, or the QAP. Nicola, the Housing Tax Credit Supervisor, will go into a little more detail about this document either later in this presentation or tomorrow. But the QAP is the foundation and the mechanism that determines the funding priorities for all of the funding resources awarded through the Multifamily Consolidated RFP. The self-scoring worksheet is attached to the QAP, which provides applicants an overview of Minnesota Housing's priorities and how we are going to score and rank the application. The methodology guide provides the geographic and community profile priorities or community priorities. Cody, our research analyst, will also go into detail on the methodology guide tomorrow or in day 2. Next, we have the RFP, multifamily RFP standards. Again, the RFP standards set the requirements for all of the funding resources or sources and programs in the consolidated RFP. The underwriting standards are our requirements for how we will underwrite each project and determine its feasibility. And finally, the building standards are the requirements for how all projects must be constructed or built. Next slide, please. On this slide, I want to introduce you to all of the program guides, or for clarity, our funding sources. The difference from the policy and guidance documents from the previous slides versus the guides displayed on this page are, depending on the funding source or program that the project is awarded under, there are additional requirements that are very specific to that funding source. Each program guide includes the eligible uses, priorities, and other requirements. For an example, the Economic Development and Housing Challenge Program, there are funds set aside to serve Native and Indigenous communities. For another example is HIB. Though senior housing is eligible, only independent living model is eligible and assisted living facilities are not. Each program manager will go into detail with their programs either today or tomorrow, but these are just a few examples of why it is extremely important for applicants to review and understand each program guide as they are completing their application. Next slide, please. So looking at the different eligibility types and activities, there are 4 different project types. Workforce housing, which are projects located in areas of job growth. Preservation, which are projects at risk of loss and that preserves existing federal assistance. Permanent supportive housing, which are projects that serve homeless households or people with disabilities, and senior housing, which are projects for seniors over the age of 55. Just a few of the eligibility activities include new construction, acquisition, rehab, adaptive reuse, preservation, demolition, construction costs, and much more. The multifamily RFP standard is a document is already on the website and has all these additional details. Again, I would definitely take a closer look at the RFP standards. It is very helpful information regarding the standards and the processes that we use. Next slide, please. As I had mentioned on the previous slide, the Consolidated RFP is Minnesota Housing's largest competitive RFP, where the agency awards and allocates federal and state resources to develop and preserve rental homes that are affordable throughout the state. We will go into detail with each program and funding source later today and tomorrow's presentation, but I do want to give you guys a quick introduction to the funding sources that are available through the Consolidated RFP. The federal programs include the Low Income Housing Tax Credit, or each tax credit, HOME, National Housing Trust Fund, and HUD Section 811 Project-Based Rental Assistance. Next slide, please. The state appropriations and bonding capital funding programs include Lemire First Mortgage, which is amortizing, bridge loans, Economic Development Housing Challenge, flexible financing for capital costs, housing infrastructure bonds, and preservation affordable rental investment fund, so PARIF. Resources available can vary each year based on state and federal appropriations. Collectively, these programs have led to the construction or preservation of more than 10,400 rental homes since 2016 through the Consolidated RFP, with a total development cost exceeding $2 billion. Next slide, please. Minnesota Housing also partners with public entities to provide additional resources. This 2023 Multifamily Consolidated RFP, we are joined by Metropolitan Council and St. Paul Public Housing Agency. Together, they have made available grants and project-based vouchers. As you see in the slide, Met Council has made available $2.5 million in LHIA grants, and St. Paul Public Housing Agency has made available 125 project-based vouchers, including an additional 25 HUD-VASH vouchers. Both funding partners will be sharing more information in tomorrow's presentation. Next slide, please. I want to take a closer look at the entire Multifamily Consolidated RFP selection framework and principles. You may have already gathered a generous amount of information around our scoring requirements from the self-scoring worksheet as well as the scoring guide. However, the Multifamily Consolidated RFP is very competitive, so the project score matters. But it isn't the only selection factor that Minnesota Housing will use in order to select projects. These components listed on the screen are viable to the selection process. These includes, but are not limited to, reviewing the project's eligibility, including a review of the project, housing and project type, the housing activity, and how the project aligns with available resources from Minnesota Housing and our funding partners. Project feasibility, which ranges from an analysis of the architectural schematics to the population served in the region, to the market and the community. Organizational and financial capacity, to determine if the project team can successfully close and manage the project long-term. A review of the project compared to the strategic and selection priorities outlined in the QAP and Minnesota Housing Strategic Plan. All applications are scored according to the priorities contained in the self-scoring worksheet and then ranked based on the score. The more aligned the project is, the higher it will score. Every point claimed by the applicant on the self-scoring worksheet is a commitment that is memorialized in the housing tax credit or deferred legal documents that are recorded on the property. We also look at the deferred loan funding priorities. This is a review of how the project compares to the deferred funding priorities or requirements for specific programs. Not all deferred loans are created equal, or deferred funds are created equal. Excuse me. Each of the funding sources have limitations that impact project types, geographic locations, and distribution, preferences, or set-asides. All of these things dictate the type of funding that the project can qualify for. Projects must be compatible with our underwriting and design standards. And lastly, we will also make decisions based on available resources, geographic balance, and supporting a balance of project types across Minnesota. Next slide, please. This is a visual representation of how projects are ranked and reviewed. We first determine if the application is eligible. We then sort applications into one of the 4 primary project types, which are workforce, preservation, supportive housing, and senior. From there, we sort applications by proposal type. So for an example, 9% housing tax credit only, deferred applications, and etc. That's where we start to look at specific program policies and how they align with the characteristics of the projects. Then finally, we apply the selection framework that I just discussed in the previous slide, including the score within each project type. Next slide, please. Click again. So let's look at the general timeline. Specific dates vary annually, but this general timeline for the Multifamily Consolidated RFP is fairly consistent each year. In general, the application and the materials are released in March and April. This includes checklist items, forms, instructions, program guides, and the standards. We release these materials on our website and in the Multifamily Customer Portal. Pre-applications for those who are interested are also due in April. The intent to apply is due in May. The ITA, or intent to apply, let us know that you are interested in applying and provides us with some preliminary characteristics and information about your project. This is required for all applicants interested in submitting the application. So again, the intent to apply is due on May 11. The full application is then due in July, and those applications are again submitted through the Multifamily Customer Portal. And finally, funding recommendations are submitted to Minnesota Housing Boards of Directors in December. Next slide, please. We develop these tools and resources for you. Technical assistance is provided by our skilled team to help applicants submit strong applications. Technical assistance is advisory only and does not guarantee funding. Our e-news includes general information such as training, important dates, and much more. Our website has been completely revamped. As Sarah had mentioned, we strongly recommend you play on our website to see where all of our information are. Otherwise, I will be going over the website a little bit more in detail tomorrow. But the agency website includes all items related to the agency, the portal, our application facilitation tool. If you haven't already, set up your access to populate your application materials, track your application process, submit your application, and communicate with agency staff after selection determination. That concludes my introduction to the Multifamily Consolidated RFP. I will now hand it over to Erin Coons, who will provide you introduction to underwriting.
Hello everyone, my name is Erin Coons and I'm an underwriter for the agency. Today I'm going to be going over some initial steps for submitting your application, the workbook, and how to request technical assistance. Next slide. When getting started on your application, the best place to begin is on our website by navigating to the Consolidated RFP page. Here you will find links to our underwriting standards, the workbook, and our current rent and income limits. The underwriting standards will help guide you on our process for how we review the workbook. These standards allow us to be consistent across applications. If you need technical assistance regarding your application, you can request it from that page. Next slide. If you ever get lost while on the site, you can always navigate back to the Consolidated RFP page by using the links on the menu on the side of the page. There are also links within the menu to program guides, past RFP selection and scoring, and how to get started within the portal. If you're ever looking for the workbook, you can find it by navigating back to the Consolidated RFP page, where it will be listed under the application resources. Next slide. The workbook is our primary tool for reviewing and underwriting your project. It contains your funding source request, the rent structure, your operating and development budgets, and the total sources you are requesting for the development, as well as any other non-agency sources that have already been committed. When filling out the workbook, you want to make sure that you take time to read the instructions completely. At the bottom of the workbook, there are tabs. Blue tabs must be completed by the applicant. Green tabs need to be completed if you're requesting housing tax credits, and gray tabs are automatically populated. Some cells are locked from inputting information in. You can input information into the blue cells. White cells are either locked for formulas or they pull from other cells within the workbook. Help text within the workbook can be found by hovering over the red triangles within the cells. Next slide. You'll notice on the funding request tab, there are white cells which information cannot be entered into. This is because that data is pulled from our sources tab. Cells within the workbook are connected in order to avoid errors. This also saves you time from having to repeat information throughout the workbook. Next slide, please. On the Sources tab, you will list out all the sources of funding that you're requesting for your development, as well as any other committed sources. Some of the sources you may have on there may be from funding partners. It's important to include these funds, even if they aren't committed yet. Within the permanent sources section, you should include your amortizing sources, your deferred sources, any rebates, tax credits if applicable, and the deferred developer fee. The Sources tab will also include your construction-only funding, like bridge loans for your tax credits and rebates, as well as any new subsidy that is coming into your project. It is important that the workbook matches the information you have provided in your narrative, as all parts of the application will be referenced against the workbook, including the self-scoring worksheet. Next slide. Underwriting sizing is an important part of how we structure our financing. Through the help of our asset management team, we review the operating budget and rents to make sure that the budget aligns with similar affordable housing developments within our portfolio. This helps allow us to maximize the amortizing debt. From there, we will review the development budget to make sure that it meets the underwriting standards. If you are applying for tax credits, we will review your request next by sizing it based on several factors, which includes the eligible basis within your development budget, the set aside if you are requesting one, and then the maximum allowable tax credits for the development. Once all the sources are reviewed, we will begin to size the deferred request. Three main tabs that we use to size our underwriting for our housing for underwriting are the housing income, income and expense, and then the mortgage calculation. Next slide. As mentioned earlier, technical assistance is an important way to ensure you are completing your application. Once the RFP deadline has passed, we are no longer able to contact you regarding questions about your application. By meeting with staff ahead of time, we can answer any questions, provide guidance for submitting your application. Technical assistance can be requested on our website by completing a form regarding your project. You can request technical assistance for areas outside of scoring and underwriting. Staff within that area will be assigned to assist you with your questions. It's important to request technical assistance as soon as possible so we can work with you to answer any questions that you have. Next slide. So with that, I will be turning the presentation over to Nicola, who will be going over housing tax credits.
Great, thank you, Erin. Hello, everyone. My name is Nicola Viana, and I'm the Housing Tax Credit Supervisor at Minnesota Housing. In today's session, I'll provide a general overview of housing tax credits, and we will use the acronym HTC, and this refers to the Federal Low-Income Housing Tax Credits. Next slide, please. The Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program is one of the principal federal mechanisms contained within tax law for the acquisition, substantial rehabilitation, and new construction of low-income rental housing. The HTC program is the nation's oldest and most successful affordable housing program. It started in 1987. HTC is outlined in the Internal Revenue Code, or IRC, Section 42, and Internal Revenue Service, or IRS, guidance. The HTC program provides tax credits to companies and individuals that invest in affordable rental housing, reducing their federal tax liability by the amount of tax credit for 10 years. In exchange for this reduction in tax liability, investors purchase the tax credits and agree to keep units affordable to households at certain income levels. In today's market, $1 of tax credits sells for about 85 to 95 cents, depending on varying factors like location and area market analysis. The sale proceeds from the credits are then invested in new construction of affordable housing or acquisition and rehabilitation of existing properties. Minnesota Housing awards and allocates federal tax credits to owners of qualified affordable rental housing projects, and those owners selected for credits usually sell those tax credits to an investor or syndicator in exchange for capital to build or rehab eligible affordable rental housing units. Next slide. The IRS requires every HTC allocator to have a plan for allocating credits to developments, which is the Qualified Allocation Plan, or the QAP, which Q mentioned earlier. There are certain IRS and state requirements about what must be included. For example, every allocator must provide preference for projects located in low-income areas that contribute to community revitalization. Minnesota Housing's QAP is made up of the QAP document and the self-scoring worksheet. These two documents outline how HTCs will be distributed throughout the state, which types of projects will be eligible for the set-aside of credits, how funding rounds will be administered, and what rules and procedures applicants in Minnesota Housing must abide by, as well as funding priorities we consider. Minnesota Housing's QAP is also the mechanism that determines the funding priorities for all the funding resources awarded in the annual Multifamily Consolidated RFP. All applications are scored according to the priorities contained in the self-scoring worksheet, and then they're ranked based on their score. Every point claimed by an applicant on the self-scoring worksheet is a commitment that is memorialized in the HTC legal documents or the deferred legal documents. Next slide, please. So when you apply in the Multifamily Consolidated RFP, you will score your project in the scoring wizard found in the Multifamily Customer Portal. There are two key documents you will need. And on the website, you'll see these. It's the self-scoring worksheet, which I just mentioned. This is the source of truth. This document will be your main reference tool for understanding the points you claim in the scoring wizard. The second document to the right in purple here is the scoring guide. This guide is the companion document and reference to the self-scoring worksheet. Much of the supporting documentation is listed in the self-scoring worksheet, but the scoring guide contains more detail, clarifications, and directions on where to submit the information. We will offer a separate training on how to score and how Minnesota Housing will score your application on May 2nd, and we will make sure to record that as well, but be sure to check our e-news or our website for details on that. I will be providing that training on May 2nd. Once you enter your scores in the scoring wizard, you upload your documents into the portal application checklist. We encourage you to request technical assistance and attend our scoring trainings. You can understand the scoring materials and you can submit a competitive application. All right, next slide. So back to the specifics on housing tax credits. There are two types of tax credits, commonly referred to as 9% and 4% tax credits. The HTC program is designed to subsidize either 30% or 70% of low-income unit costs in a project. The 30% subsidy, which is known as the 4% tax credit, covers new construction that uses additional subsidies or the acquisition of existing buildings. And the 70% or 9% tax credits support new construction without any additional federal subsidies, but you can apply for deferred funding through Minnesota Housing. So the 9% credits have a higher applicable percentage than 4% credits, which allows for more basis to be captured and translating to more equity or syndication proceeds to the development. The fact that credits are limited and have a higher rate makes 9% credits extremely competitive. Requests for 9% credits are typically 3 or 4 times greater than the amount of credits available. Applicants can apply for 9% credits in the multifamily Consolidated RFP, which is round 1 of tax credits, and another time during the year where we call it round 2, which is typically a much smaller round. Applicants who apply in the Multifamily Consolidated RFP may apply for 9% or deferred funding, or 9% and deferred funding, or for deferred funding with a 4% credit financial structure. Projects that receive an award of tax-exempt volume limited bonds from Minnesota Management and Budget may apply for 4% tax credits through an open application process or pipeline process called the 4% only round. Next slide, please. Projects must set aside a minimum number of units that meet both income and rent restrictions to qualify for HTCs for each year of the HTC period. A project must, for a specific period of time, meet one of the following minimum tests. So you would select one of these items or one of these requirements. So the 20 at 50 means a minimum of 20% of the residential units must be both rent restricted and occupied by individuals whose income is at or below 50% of multifamily tax subsidy projects, or MTSP limits. And this is established for different geographic areas and published by HUD, and it's adjusted for family size. And this will be on our website. Or the 40 at 60, which is a minimum of 40% of the residential units must be both rent restricted and occupied by individuals whose income is at or below 60% of the MTSP limits adjusted for family size. Or you can choose the average income test, which is a minimum of 40% of units in the project are both rent restricted and occupied by individuals whose imputed income average at initial occupancy is at or below 60% of the MTSP limits. This set-aside allows projects to restrict a percentage of units at higher rent and income levels by agreeing to restrict a percentage of its units at lower rent and income limits. So it gives you a little bit more flexibility. Next slide, please. So units must comply with requirements around household income, rent limits, property requirements. Please refer to the qualified allocation plan and underwriting standards for additional information. HTCs have a compliance period of at least 15 years, plus the extended use period, which ranges from 15 to 35 years. In the self-scoring worksheet, projects can agree to extend the term of the HTC legal document or the deferred declaration for points in the RFP. So HTCs are monitored by our compliance team at Minnesota Housing, and HTC recipients are required to submit an annual certification to Minnesota Housing and agree to period inspections. And you can learn more on our website about the compliance section. All right, next slide. So I'll go into a little bit more detail on the 9% tax credits and what's available this RFP. Per federal statute, not state, 9% tax credits are allocated to states based on the state population and a per capita formula. So in Minnesota, we forward allocate our credits. So in this 2023 RFP, we are allocating 2024 credits. The 2024 Minnesota allocation statewide is estimated to be $15.7 million. The Minnesota housing allocation is $11.8 million. Our QAP also requires us to have set-asides for nonprofit entities and projects using the rural development RD financing. So you can refer to our QAP for more information on that. And in Minnesota, state statute outlines rules regarding the state tax credit program, so including how HTCs are distributed. So statute establishes Minnesota Housing as the primary allocating agency and also establishes a number of cities and counties as sub-allocators of credits. And those are Minneapolis, St. Paul, Dakota, and Washington County. They have their own allocations and their own qualified allocation plans. So projects within these sub-allocator jurisdictions are encouraged to apply for HTCs directly to these sub-allocators. So that concludes my section. I will now hand it over to William Price. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola, and hello and good morning to everyone. My name is William Price, and I am the Housing Infrastructure Bond Program Manager here at Minnesota Housing. In today's session, I'll provide a general overview of the Housing Infrastructure Bond Program, and we'll use the acronym HIB. Next slide, please. So based on the premise that housing is as much a part of Minnesota's critical infrastructure as roads and bridges, Minnesota Housing created a proposal to leverage state bonding authority to create more affordable housing. Working with the Minnesota legislature beginning in 2012, the agency first provided language for a standing authorization for the issuance of housing infrastructure bonds to address multiple critical housing needs across the state. HIBs are special, limited obligation taxes and bonds that are issued by Minnesota Housing. HIBs are unique because the debt service, principal and interest on the bonds are paid fully by state appropriations, thus not passing the cost along to the project and allowing for greater affordability. HIBs are an innovative resource to provide housing to very low income households and allows Minnesota Housing to further stretch our funding sources such as tax credits and federal resources like Home and National Housing Trust Fund. Next slide, please. Since the initial authorization of HIBs in 2012, over $500 million has been invested in affordable rental housing, including projects in our pipeline that have been selected for funding. Over 3,000 new units of housing has been created, and over 2,000 units with existing rental assistance has been preserved. HIBs are unique from GO bonds issued in the state's capital budget in that it allows for private ownership, as GO bonds have to be, the owner has to be a governmental entity. Thus, nonprofits, for-profit entities, and limited partnerships can be owners. Deeply affordable housing is often difficult to finance, since little debt is able to be supported with very low rents and incomes. HIBs provide a viable capital funding source dedicated to the most deeply affordable projects, often reserved for homeless households and those with incomes less than 30% AMI or MTSP. HIBs can also be paired with 4% housing tax credits or other state appropriated or federal funding sources, allowing the project sources to be uniquely structured to what works best for the deal's viability long term. HIBs are effective because it can use it has a range of uses, which we will discuss shortly. Next slide, please. One of the most beneficial utilities of HIBs is the flexibility in how it can be structured to finance a project. Here's a chart that really highlights those two different ways. HIBs can be paired with 4% housing tax credits, or they can be what we call a HIB deferred only loan, meaning that the tax credits are not involved in the final capital structure for the project. On the left is a boilerplate example of what the capital structure may look like for a project. You have your HIB loan, at $7 million, which is structured to meet the 50% test, allowing for 4% housing tax credits. There's your 4% housing tax credit proceeds at $3 million. First mortgage and soft funding financing sources, potentially from the local entities such as the county or the city, at $4 million, and total development costs at $14 million. And on the right-hand side, we have a structure where the HIB loan is essentially filling the gap from the omission of tax credit syndication proceeds, so that the loan is increased by $3 million to $10 million total. So why is this flexibility and structuring options important? Next slide, please. One of the primary benefits of this flexibility is that when a project applies to Minnesota Housing, we have underwriters who can go through the fine details of the financing structure and recommend the most optimal structure that will fit the project. This flexibility is especially beneficial when evaluating deferred-only loan options for supportive housing projects. Also, some projects don't generate enough tax credit syndication equity to really be viable for 4% credits, and those credits have costs. So if a project is not generating a substantial amount of tax credit equity, it may have a difficult time offsetting those costs. Some examples of a project that may not generate enough equity can be those with less than 40 units. Sometimes projects in smaller communities may have a harder time receiving investor interest for tax credits. Also, tax credits add an additional layer of complexity to a project. Thus, smaller emerging sponsors into the affordable housing who are newer to development may benefit from a financing structure that does not include tax credits and is a little bit more streamlined. Finally, the flexibility allows us to stretch our resources across the state to provide as much housing as possible in our consolidated RFP. All of these factors are used when we determine what is the best financial structure for a housing infrastructure bond project. Next slide, please. HIBs are required to meet certain federal and state bonding rules, including what those issued bonds can pay for. The largest costs for the projects, such as construction costs, developer fee, and also acquisition fees, are usually included as eligible costs and can be paid for with HIBs. There are some circumstances where a developer fee and acquisition fees may not be eligible, but once you reach the point of putting a development budget together, one of our underwriters can certainly give you more guidance. Some costs that are ineligible include all reserves included in the project, some financing costs, and also the cost of supportive services. Next slide, please. Under the governor's proposed budget, a request for $250 million has been made from the legislature in HIBs. This is the largest request made since the program's inception in 2012. The current multifamily eligible uses for HIBs are permanent supportive housing for people experiencing homelessness, independent living for seniors household 55 plus, preservation of projects with existing rental assistance. Minnesota Housing has proposed this year a new eligible use for new construction projects affordable to households at or below 50% AMI. Next slide, please. Next, I'll touch on a few details on the current eligible uses for HIBs. HIBs are Minnesota's primary tool for providing supportive housing for households who are experiencing homelessness, including youth, veterans, families, and for persons who struggle with mental illness and substance use disorders. Next slide, please. HIBs have also been a critical tool to help create housing for low-income seniors. Senior projects must provide independent living options and are not allowed to be assisted living. There are statutory priorities for senior housing that including units that serve very low-income seniors with incomes less than 30% AMI, and that projects are balanced as much as possible between the metropolitan areas and greater Minnesota in acknowledgement of senior housing needs across the state. Although assisted living is not allowed, projects must provide a plan for how tenants will be provided access to supportive services that can change and augment as they age. Next slide, please. Lastly, to address the existing affordable housing stock with rental assistance and capital needs. HIBs have been an important tool to complement other resources to preserve existing affordable housing, prevent unit loss, and avert the displacement of households. Since 2012, over 2,000 units have been preserved and rehabilitated specifically with the HIB program. Projects must meet a preservation risk of loss with critical physical needs, a risk of market conversion, or issues with ownership capacity. Next slide, please. If you plan to apply for HIBs, be sure to contact Minnesota Housing Underwriting Team or myself for technical assistance. HIBs are awarded annually in the Consolidated RFP, and after selection, bonds are typically issued once a year the following fall after selection. Thank you for your time this morning. I will now hand it over to my colleague, Vicki Farden.
Good morning. Hi, I'm Vicki Farden, and I'm the Supportive Housing Team Lead at Minnesota Housing. So, thank you, Patty. So we're going to go through this fairly quickly, but I want to remind you that we will have a Supportive Housing TA session on May 3rd that you can register in the information that Q referenced earlier. So for a quick overview of people new to supportive housing, supportive housing is affordable housing linked with services tailored to the needs of the population and designed to foster housing stability. There's many types of supportive housing that serve different populations, but our funding is focused on serving people experiencing homelessness and persons with disabilities. We expect providers to follow best practices such as housing first, person-centered planning, and trauma-informed care. We also encourage providers to follow the new supportive housing standards adopted by the Supportive Housing Alliance, which is an interagency work group of funders and industry organizations. You can learn more about best practices and other information about supportive housing in our Supportive Housing Information and Resources publication and our supportive housing webpage, which is linked on these slides. Next slide. So we incentivize the creation of supportive housing units by providing points to create units to serve high priority homeless households, which are households prioritized for supportive housing by the coordinated entry system. There are 3 scoring tiers based on the number of supportive housing units in the project. We also provide points to create units to serve people with disabilities, which we call PWD units. These units are intended to serve extremely low-income people with a disability. There's also 3 scoring tiers for this category based on the number of units. There's also a second scoring category for PWD units that will use HUD Section 811 project-based rental assistance. Next slide. We've made some significant changes to the application process this year. We know the application process is challenging and doesn't allow a lot of time for planning supportive housing units with the community to meet the local needs. So we had several goals to simplify the application process and create supportive housing units that better meet community need. We created 2 categories for applications with supportive housing, and the requirements are quite different depending on the type of supportive housing that you'll be doing. For partially supportive housing projects, which is fewer than 50% of the units to serve high priority homeless, persons with disabilities, and other homeless households, the applications will be more conceptual, with the planning work happening after selection. For primary supportive housing, which is 50% or more of the units are supportive housing, we still require the same type of planning and application requirements that we've had in the past. These projects are usually responding to an identified community need and are more complex to put together for a feasible project. Next slide. So, as I mentioned in the last slide, applications with the project that will be partially supportive housing will be more conceptual and are not required to develop a plan for the units at the time of application. With a few exceptions, if you're applying for HUD Section 811 PRA, you'll need to complete the pre-application and also the application materials at the application time. And Ellie Miller will be talking about that in a few minutes. We also encourage all applicants to try to secure project-based Section 8, project-based rental assistance for the supportive housing units. So there's only 2 required application forms for partial supportive housing, which are the partially supportive housing certification form and the notification to the COC and county or tribal human services. Applicants will also need to follow the underwriting assumptions outlined on the certification form. Next slide. There's also optional forms applicants may submit if needed for other application points. You might choose to submit the service provider qualification form for points under the Black, Indigenous, People of Color, and Women-Owned Business category, or the Housing Support Commitment form if you need that for rental assistance points. There's also underwriting assumptions to follow for partial supportive housing applications. To make sure that that basic tenant service coordination can be provided and not totally dependent on billable services, applicants must include expenses for basic service coordination in the operating budget. The expenses should be calculated following the examples below. Next slide. So once Minnesota Housing has scored applications, they move on to the feasibility review. At that time, we'll consult with the COC and Tribal Human Services to determine the market need for the high priority homeless units. If there's not a demonstrated market need, the HPH units will convert to 30% rent restricted units with the priority to serve households experiencing homelessness. The application does not lose the HPH points. We'll also review the market for PWD units that plan to use housing support that requires long-term homelessness. We might also adjust the project workbook to change rent levels or unique operating costs during our review. Next slide. So once a partially supportive housing project is selected for funding, we'll work with the applicant and community partners to plan the supportive housing units, which might include determining the population to be served, adjusting the unit size types, selecting a service provider, and determining the referral sources and processes to select eligible households. Also, the rental assistance and service resources will need to be secured, and we'll adjust the workbook as needed during that process. And then the selected applicant completes all the due diligence materials they need to close on the financing. So now moving on to applications that will be primarily supportive housing. These applications are quite different and require a well-developed supportive housing plan at the time of application. The application process and materials are similar to past years and include the CLC confirmation form, the supportive housing narrative, and the service provider qualification form. Applicants must also submit documentation showing funding commitments for service funding and rental assistance. And don't forget to indicate the HPH and PWD units on the workbook and note the rental assistance fee. Next slide. So all supportive housing, whoops. I think could you go back one? Okay, thanks. All supportive housing units need to have rental assistance or rents set at supportive housing levels. There needs to be a good plan to secure all resources for services and front desk if you're including one, and food service if provided. And for competitive application, most projects include at least 50% of their units are high priority homeless, and also a number of PWD units. And to be considered for housing infrastructure bonds for supportive housing, all units need to serve people experiencing homelessness. Next slide. So for planning your primarily supportive housing project, it's important to consult early in the process with the COC committee and the county or tribal human services to plan the HPH and PWD units. You'll need to choose a qualified service provider and management agent with experience in supportive housing. And you'll need to determine the funding resources for services and rental assistance, and the front desk if you plan to have one. You'll also need to work with the county or tribal human services if you'd like to apply for housing support to use for rent and possibly services for the HPH and PWD units. And note that some counties do an annual RFP for their housing support, so the timing is important for when you contact them. Next slide. So some of the typical resources for rental assistance are housing support, which provides room and board costs for persons with disabilities, project-based Section 8 from a local public housing authority, and if you can't secure rental assistance sources for all the units, the rents will need to be set at supportive housing levels, which are described in our underwriting standards. Typical sources for services for partially supportive housing, as discussed earlier, you can pay for some of those costs from the operating budget. And then housing support also has a service rate, which requires long-term homeless eligibility that can be used for services. If you're planning to use that resource for services, you need to make sure there's a market need for long-term homeless households in that community. We don't recommend that as a source for PWD units in partial supportive housing, since it requires long-term homeless eligibility, which further limits eligibility. And then there's Medicaid. There's various Medicaid funded services, such as the Housing Stabilization Service, some mental health services, as well as waiver services. Next slide. So what is housing support? It's a state-funded income supplement program that pays for room and board for low-income adults with disabilities and seniors. It can be used for single adults and families with an eligible adult, and the housing support provider contracts with the county or tribe for a specific number of units. The provider is generally the service provider for the project. The payments are made to the housing support provider to pay the rent and other costs. And the tribe or county completes the funding commitment form that you need to submit with your application and to close on the financing. And also see our underwriting standards for guidance on how to set the rents when using housing support for the supportive housing units. Next slide. And I just want to point out a few last things to make sure that you review our tenant selection plan guidelines. Make sure that your management agent is aware of the content, and also visit our webpage for all the materials to help complete a tenant selection plan and make sure you understand our requirements. And also check out the new supportive housing standards I mentioned earlier for recommended best practices that we'd like people to follow. So now I'll pass it over to Ellie Miller to tell you about the HUD Section 811 PRA.
Thank you, Vicki. Good morning. My name is Ellie Miller, and I am the program manager for the HUD Section 811 Project-Based Rental Assistance Program. Section 811 PRA will be an available resource for the 2023 RFP and is a program designed to expand the supply of available housing and promote integration for people with significant and long-term disabilities. Minnesota Housing, in partnership with the Department of Human Services, was awarded funding for a third round of Section 811 PRA to produce approximately 160 new units of housing. Next slide, please. Eligible applicants are private and public owners of multifamily properties that have been financed by Minnesota Housing or that have Minnesota Housing's housing tax credits, or owners that are in Minnesota Housing's project-based Section 8 portfolio with existing unsubsidized units. All eligible applicants must have or be willing to gain knowledge and experience in administering HUD rental assistance. Next slide. Section 811 will be made available in two ways. One is through the annual Consolidated RFP, and for existing developments, we'll be opening an open application process. Next slide. Lastly, the rental assistance targets people experiencing long-term homelessness or people exiting an institutional setting. And the referrals for the program are managed by the Minnesota Department of Human Services. For those that are considering developing units for people with disabilities, as Vicki mentioned, Section 811 is a great resource to be paired with the PWD units. If you need any more information, please reach out to me. There's also a video link that can be accessed on Minnesota Housing's website. I will now hand it over to Sarah Bunn.
Thanks, Ellie. All right. I am just showing right now contact information on the screen for everyone that just presented with Minnesota Housing. Feel free to reach out to any of those people directly via email at any time. And then moving on to the next slide. Okay, while Minnesota Housing's capacity building program does fund other organizations to provide resources for emerging developers, this is a list of our partner resources that I mentioned earlier in the presentation. So the first one is Greater Minnesota Housing Fund, and they have an emerging developer of color program that aims to support individuals and organizations led by people of color in their growth as affordable housing developers. Greater Minnesota Housing Fund is not a processing agent or a development consultant, but developers working specific housing projects may reach out to discuss the following: technical assistance, flexible project financing options, and pre-development financing. Next on the list is LISC Twin Cities, Developers of Color Capacity Building Initiative. And this initiative goes beyond training to provide implementation capacity support to help developers of color get their projects over the finish line. The program offers significant financial and technical resources to developers of color, including funding for pre-development and project management support, and access to equity and permanent financing to help fill financial gaps. Next on the list, we have Urban Land Institute's Minnesota's, Urban Land Institute Minnesota's Real Estate Diversity Program. And this is a cohort experience designed for professionals identifying as Black, Indigenous, people of color, and women working in real estate. All right, next slide, please. So we are now going to move into the question and answer session, but to begin this, I want to go ahead and hand things over to Q Vang, and she is going to give us a quick demo of Minnesota Housing's new website. Take it away, Q. Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you. Let me go ahead and make sure I'm sharing the right screen. And can you tell me what you see right now? Is there a screen that you're seeing?
It looks like a winter scene.
Okay. So I apologize, everyone. We did not play this one yet. So you're seeing a winter screen. This one? So you see the website now.
Do not. Just looks like the winter scene screensaver.
All right.
There we go.
All right. So let me go ahead and get this ready. Thank you. All right. Thank you, everyone, for bearing with us. As we had mentioned multiple times now, the Minnesota Housing has now launched a brand new website. So we did feel that it was important to go ahead and give you a quick demo of the website so you are able to find all the necessary information that you need. So on the website, we are still mnhousing.gov, and this would be our landing page. There are a few options or a few ways you would be able to search for the multifamily consolidated RFP and housing tax credit or any of our funding sources or applications. One option would be the rental housing button here. And then another would be if you were to identify yourself as a developer here, or if you were to go to I want to renovate or build rental housing, I think that would be the option there, or yes, finding the option there. So I'm going to go my way that I have been most accustomed to, and that's actually going to the rental housing navigation button here, and then clicking on housing development and capital programs. So as you see there, you will be moved into the housing development and capital funding programs page, where you are able to see requests for proposal information, information regarding our capital funding programs. As you see there, we have listed amortizing mortgages, tax credits, and deferred loans, as well as post-election and requests for action change notifications. On the left here, you will also see a quick menu or a menu where you're able to quickly access any of this information. As you see there, we do have listed the multifamily consolidated RFP. But to continue to show the efforts, I'm going to go ahead and select request for proposal information. On the request for proposals information, we do make available where you are able to see all the funding types that we are actively soliciting for. As you see here, we're not only we do not currently have just the multifamily consolidated RFP open. We do also have RRLD, as well as our pipeline 4% only. Clearly, I'm going to go ahead and select multifamily consolidated RFP today. And then now you'll be on the multifamily consolidated RFP page. As you scroll down, again, the website does have very useful information We provide information regarding the consolidated RFP in general. Again, we continue to suggest or recommend technical assistance. And then we go into the information or all of our training, as we have been alluding, many of us have been alluding to earlier in the presentation. In this event calendar section, this is where all of our trainings or upcoming trainings are. Again, I would highly recommend you sign up for all of our trainings. Today, we are in the day 1, but again, as Vicki and Nicola had mentioned earlier, we are going to do a self-scoring worksheet, a worksheet training, as well as a supportive housing updates. Scrolling down in this accordion is where the bulk of the information regarding the consolidated RFP is. In here, in this section, we have the static view of all the due dates. And if this is hard to see, I'm gonna go ahead and blow it up a tad. In this section, the consolidated RFP application dates are front and center, making sure that you are aware of all the deadlines that are coming up regarding applications. The next section here, where you are able to expand all or just be be selective of what you want to see, we started to include the capital funding and program resources. In this is where, in the capital funding and program resources, this is where we really share what kind of funding sources are in fact available through the consolidated RFP, and then provide you with references or links to where you can navigate to those pages. Application resources, I spent the bulk of my presentation talking about the policy and guidance documents. We did throw it all on this page for you to really be able to review each policy and guidance document so that you can review them, as well as have a very collective understanding of all the requirements for the consolidated RFP. I am going to continue to plug the RFP proposal standards, or the RFP standards. That is the first document that I did in fact include there. And then again, the program and other specific documentations or requirements are listed here. I also include the pre-application information materials. Again, we right now have 2 pre-applications, HUD Section 811 that Ellie just covered, as well as the preference for innovative construction techniques. Those applications, pre-applications, are going to be due on April 27th. I'm gonna double check if that is correct. So bear with me, is April 27th. Good, okay. The next item that we have here are, as Vicki had been just sharing, we have changed the high priority homelessness and people with disabilities. So we do include, we did include a very some general basic information here. But again, all of this information here is in fact listed in the application materials. So you are able to review and see all this information in the application materials itself. We also include the funding partner application information, and so how to be considered, what you need to do, eligible uses, etc. But again, all of our funding partners, both Met Council as well as St. Paul Public Housing Agency, will be presenting on their information tomorrow. So you are definitely able to join us there. And then the one I think that most people are most interested in is the application materials. The application materials is also referenced here. My biggest tip, and I even put it here, create the application in the multifamily customer portal. When you have access to the multifamily customer portal, including our funding partners, all of the checklist items will automatically populate based on what you preliminarily select as the characteristics. And when I say characteristics, I'm talking about, are you building a new construction? Are you building a preservation? Are you interested in different, what type of funding proposal types? So the multifamily customer portal will be your best friend. It will auto-populate all of your application materials for you. That will be my biggest tip. Otherwise, you are able to navigate to the application materials page. We are very explicit in saying that the material on this page is in fact for reference only if you are interested in trying to figure out what documentation you'll need to submit your application. But again, the multifamily customer portal will auto-populate for you, where you will be able to see and download those materials as well. But again, as you see on the applications materials page, we have outlined exactly the type of documents that you'll need: the pre-application, general application forms, different construction types, proposal types, project types, and then NHTF operating subsidy, as well as our funding partners information. I would suggest, if you're interested and do not have access to portal yet, first, get access to portal. Second, if you are interested in viewing this information, then just going ahead and opening up these accordions to look at all of the information or application materials or checklist items for each area. So as you see here, we really lay it out and just state that only this document here is for new constructions. This is for all proposal types, etc. I am going to go back one. And then the last item that I want to share on the consolidated RFP is all of our tools and training resources. Again, we have the customer portal, and then we also include all of our portal training tutorials, which are really short. I want to say less than 5 minutes, where you're able to access them and see how to complete or how to navigate the portal, and as well as look at all the application processes. We do also do an archive of all of our application e-newses or RFP e-newses if you are in fact interested. But we do, and then of course, signing up for the Consolidated RFP website e-newses so that you can be up to date with all of our information. And I am going to hand it back over to Sarah.
Thank you, Q. We would now officially move into the question and answer session. I'm going to ask that all of our panelists turn on their cameras so that they are ready to answer any questions that come in. As I mentioned earlier, there are two primary ways to ask questions in today's presentation. You can use the hand raise button, and we will unmute your line and call on you, or you can type your question into the question or chat box of the toolbar. We'll respond to as many questions as we can during the session, but if you do not hear back from us, we will capture all questions and respond to you following today's webinar. So with that being said, I'm just going to go ahead and get right into the questions that I've seen so far. First one we have is, when you submit an application, do you get to choose the source of deferred funding for your project? Summer, do you want to jump in and answer the question?
So, no, as Q, thank you for the question. As Q had mentioned, I think in her piece for the Consolidated RFP, part of it is that you don't necessarily get to choose or select a specific funding source. So when you get into the workbook, it will just essentially ask you how much deferred funds do you need, and you'll kind of incorporate that. And so that way, you're not specifically asking for a specific funding source, and that's just because of the fact that we are looking at the different funding priorities that each program has. It gives us, as Q mentioned, more flexibility to determine which projects would be eligible for certain funding sources. It makes it easier, I think, from an applicant perspective, also just because trying to figure out, is it eligible for challenge and HIB or home or NHTF or tax credits while you're trying to apply, that can be extremely complicated. So part of the great pieces of the multifamily consolidated RFP is that you just apply, let us know what your need is, and then we kind of do the behind the scenes to see if the proposal type project type would be eligible for certain funding sources. The only thing that you would actually indicate would be if you are interested in a first mortgage, you would actually be able to select that. Housing tax credits, you can actually say, I want 9% housing tax credits. There's also, I think, a box where you would indicate if you are interested in deferred with a 4% financial structure. So you would check the box saying that that you want to use 4% housing tax credits. We don't necessarily award 4% housing tax credits in the RFP, but it essentially lets us know what financial structure you're looking at or what you're considering for the proposal.
Okay, thank you, Summer, for answering that question. Moving on to the next, could you say more, and I think this one is directed at Erin, about what the underwriting standards cover?
Sure. So they cover everything from how we review credit worthiness, how we look at the borrower developer ownership structure, how we look at income, and that can include rent revenue, but also if there's other income or commercial income, what vacancy factors we use. If you're looking into income averaging, it would go over that, as well as interim income if it's an existing development and you're doing a rehab. Other than that, we also look at, it also includes the expenses, so your management and operating expenses, but also property tax. And then during construction, construction contingency, construction oversight fees, as well as other fees like your developer fee, your architect fee, your general contractor fee. And then it also goes over replacement reserves, as well as our operating deficit escrow, which is required in all of our amortizing first mortgages. It goes over the income inflators that you would use that go into the cash flow so we can see how the property will operate, as well as the debt coverage ratio. It goes over our appraisal requirements, and then which types of developments would need an appraisal. Not all require one, depending on the funding sources that you're applying for. It goes over purchase price and how to calculate that, as well as any other acquisition related costs. It does briefly go over types of funding sources, so our amortizing loans, how we review deferred loans, if there's cash flow note provisions attached to the deferred loans, bridge loans, and then if your property has a TIF or a tax increment financing loan, how we would incorporate that into the underwriting of our first mortgage. For existing developments, it also goes over relocation and tenant displacement, and then briefly goes over how, towards the end of our underwriting, how we look at closing and balance and kind of turning the file over, the property over to our closing department. And then it does cover also some fair housing requirements, the misuse of funds, and then our disclosures and reportings. So I think that covers it all. If there's any other questions that came up, I'd be happy to answer them.
Okay, thanks, Erin, for that. I'm going to go ahead and call on a raised hand. Andrea Kidd, we
Hi.
have your line. Go ahead with your question.
So there's kind of more than one question here, but how much experience in the real estate development field should I have in order to submit an application? And is this something that an individual could or should apply for, or is this normally something that like an individual from an organization applies for? And then also, should an applicant have their own capital?
I can maybe start, and then anybody else can also jump in. To start, we do look at capital or credit, the credit of the applicant. Normally, what we do see are companies that are applying, so developers or owners who have a company and have development experience. That said, we have seen some newer applicants come in to us for technical assistance, and we work with them over the years just to, as they gain more experience. And our recommendation, if you are newer to the industry, is to partner with other people within the industry. So there are processing agents that are processing consultants that can help you to navigate the multifamily industry and our application process. And you work with them, you would hire them, and they help you with the application process, but also through the underwriting process to closing. When someone is a newer applicant, we also look at the development team. So there's the owner, the developer, the architect that you would be working with, the construction company that you'd be working with, to kind of mitigate a little bit of the risk of you being new to the industry. So those are some of the things that we kind of cover with newer applicants. But technical assistance is something, or starting, it is somewhat complicated, I guess, as far as just the industry itself, just trying to do with multifamily rental. So starting to just have conversations, reviewing training what you're doing, and then also just kind of starting to dig into some of the application materials requirements will also give you a bit more experience and expertise. From a TA perspective, we do and have over time, we do have, I guess, different tracks if you're a newer applicant that hasn't necessarily worked with us, so that we can do more of more TA, extensive TA with you. So versus an applicant that has already applied to Minnesota Housing or has more of a affordable housing background. So that is also something that we are building out and trying to create more space and time to work with newer applicants as well. So anyone else have anything else to add?
Andrea, thank you for the question. Somewhat just to augment what you were saying, Q and Nicola mentioned earlier about the different kind of scoring parameters that come with our self-scoring worksheet, and within our new qualified allocation plan, we've really incentivized newer developers who may be Black, Indigenous, or persons of color, those who are merging into the industry, who are looking to get a couple developments under their belt. We've also added incentives for partnerships. There are folks who may be ready to get that first development across the finish line and apply in the annual Consolidated RFP. And there may be folks who may also benefit from partnering with a more established developer too. So there are different ways that we've kind of structured the self-scoring worksheet to be able to incentivize emerging developers, especially those who are Black, Indigenous, and persons of color, and also women-owned developers too, in terms of where they are, and providing different paths to potentially get a project across the finish line. So I know we've all kind of mentioned technical assistance. Certainly don't want to understate that, and it can't be stated enough that everyone on this call is really passionate about affordable housing and also really working with you to really bring your vision to fruition. So please come and talk to us. Any questions that you have about a project, even if it's in the early concept stages, we can kind of give you some general direction at those early concept stages, but also kind of once you are fine-tuning your project, we can dive in and really make sure that you're prepared to apply in the RFP.
Thank you, William. Okay, I'm going to move on.
I'm sorry, William. I'm American Indian and also obviously a woman. Am I able to reach out to you in regards to what you just added?
Sure, no, absolutely. You can shoot me an email and we can have a conversation about the project that you're envisioning, and no, definitely you can certainly reach out to me directly.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Okay, so moving on to the next question that we have. How important is it to come with commitments of funding from other entities? For example, soft debt, grants, etc., from local governments. And I'll make a brief comment on this, and then I'll let someone that's a little bit more familiar with our scoring and engrossed in that and elaborate. So I would say, just generally speaking, it's very important, because especially if you want your project to score well, that's something we definitely look at as far as scoring is concerned. So yes, it's important, and I will let someone else jump in to kind of say more about that specific scoring category and what that looks like.
Well, I don't know if Nick, well, so I guess I could.
Yeah, I wasn't sure which scoring category or what the question was. Sorry, Summer. I could probably answer, but is that about the financial feasibility and readiness to proceed?
Yeah, the
Okay.
two contributions and financial readiness.
Yeah, I can start, and then Summer, you can fill in where I miss. But yes, in the self-scoring worksheet, there is a selection category or criteria for financial readiness to proceed and other contributions. And there are points if you do have some sources committed to the project. So I would say take a look at that self-scoring worksheet and the points available, because it's the more sources you have and the higher the percentage, then the more points are available. So again, I'll cover a little bit more of that in the training too. But Summer, is there anything else you would want to say in addition to that?
Yeah, I would, as Nicola mentioned, I would take a look at the scoring. The points for those two are pretty substantial. And as Q mentioned, the RFP is very competitive, so every point does matter. The reason that those commitments are important to the agency is that we want to ensure just buy-in and collaboration amongst the different public funders in that city and that area, denoting that project is important to them, and a financial contribution and participation is a way to kind of measure that and to help, help us to spread our resources throughout the state of Minnesota, but then also to reduce costs. Other contributions is a selection criteria that we have, where that city or that area is saying that we're going to waive certain fees, or maybe the developers, or maybe you're waiving certain fees. And again, that's also just to reduce costs to the industry in general, and just to, again, altogether try to reduce all the cost to the industry, spread resources farther, inevitably, and to provide lower rents for the residents that will occupy the buildings. What else would there? So yes, those are some of the reasons that commitments are important to us, and why we look to them and incentivize them in our scoring. In addition to that,
note that it's not.
Sorry. In addition to that, I will say that William talked about the dual application process. So we do sometimes change. We will what we call flip projects to a different structure, and in times when we have limited resources, the amount of money that you are requesting from us can also, in addition to scoring, be the deciding factor of whether we can move forward. So if we get to the end and you're asking for $8 million versus a project that's asking for $2 million, that can sometimes be the deciding factor of whether or not we can move forward with your project. So the less amount of money that you need for your project, it helps to improve your potential chance of being able to be funded. So sorry, Nicola.
No worries. I just want to clarify and add to what you said, where it's not required in your application, but it does increase the competitiveness of your application.
So just to recap, thank you, Nicola and Summer, for jumping in on that question. Just to recap, to understand the importance of other funding commitments in your application, go to the self-scoring worksheet that is on our website and take a look specifically at the following two scoring categories. First is other contributions, and then the second is readiness to proceed. All right. Moving on, we have a question for Vicki. I heard that the continuum of care process might change to presenting to the continuum of care boards after MHFA awards were announced. Just want to double check that there aren't any significant changes this year compared to prior years.
Yes, that is correct for partially supportive housing projects. If you can look back at the part of the presentation that talked about that, and also in the application materials. But basically, if you're doing a partial supportive housing project where just some of the units are supportive housing in a project, the planning work and working with the COC happens after selection. So the application is more conceptual. Right now, you just notify the COC and the county that you're applying, so they know there's application for funding for a project in their area. We consult with them during the process about the market need, and then the planning work would happen after selection. Since we only fund like 1 in 4 projects, we're trying to cut down on the time and that people have to spend consulting on projects until they're actually ready to, they've been funded. So you still need to do that for 100% for the primarily supportive housing. You still need to go to the COC prior to the application to present your project and get feedback and submit that COC confirmation form. So, hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Vicki. Moving on to our next question, and this is directed at Erin. Is there a standard for how much of the development fee should be deferred? Can we provide soft debt instead so that it doesn't need to be repaid in full within the compliance period of 15 years?
Yes, there's no requirement for how much fee you need to defer, but if you do defer fee, you can count it in your financial readiness to proceed. If you have another soft source that you could put into the deal other than deferred developer fee, depending on what that source is, you could also potentially count that into the financial readiness. I hope that answers the question.
Can I?
Yep.
I just want to add a little bit to what Erin said. So from a scoring perspective, I will say that the self-scoring worksheet does kind of use a 10-year as a threshold so that it should be able to be paid back within 10 years. And that's prior to the end of, that's within the 15-year compliance period. And so one of the reasons, while we don't necessarily have a requirement in our underwriting standards, one of the reasons that we use that threshold, or one that we might ask questions about it, I guess, would be because a lot of the times if you are getting 9% or tax credits, the investor wants those funds to be able to be paid within the 15-year compliance period, because otherwise there can be tax penalties and tax issues where that deferred developer fee may not be considered real debt or real loan to the property. And so there can be tax consequences after a certain period. So generally the investors that give the equity or the proceeds for the property, they have certain indicators for them where they're comfortable. That could be anywhere from 10 to 15 years. But I've not seen things, or I've not seen anything beyond the 15-year compliance period, because that essentially is the period that they have to prove it out for from a tax perspective and from a recapture perspective. And then 15 years, that's when generally they're exiting the partnership. If it's not a tax credit project, then I think maybe there's more flexibility for sure, but just something to take in consideration too. So
yeah, and if that other source to replace the developer fee is a loan or another commitment. Depending on what it is, if it is a loan from another source, we'd want that to be likely coterminous with any deferred source that we put in. So that would have a longer period than that 10-year, likely something closer to 30.
Okay, thank you, Erin and Summer. Patty, if you wouldn't mind clicking through to the last slide. I think we're just a few minutes over time here, so I'm going to go ahead, one more slide, and close us out here. So thank you all for taking the time to join us today. I'd like to also encourage you to join us for tomorrow's session, day 2, which will focus on updates and new information for the multifamily consolidated RFP, so the current RFP for 2023-2024. That event also starts at 9:30 tomorrow morning, and the link to register is available on our website. With all that being said, thank you again. And should you have any questions or anything else that you want to communicate to us, feel free to grab the email addresses that are on the slides. Again, this whole presentation has been recorded and will be posted on our website under that resources section, and the slides will also be posted there as well. So thanks again, everyone, and we'll hopefully see all of you tomorrow.